pandemic had many vendors see planned weddings get cancelled literally a day or a week before the planned date. And for some of the smaller businesses, they were ultimately personally affected by food being made or ingredients being bought and now not being able to use those. And you can just imagine the pain that it puts in the pocket for the foreseeable future, especially in a pandemic where you're just not sure where this is going to end. So I think like for a couple under normal circumstances first, what is a fair period of notice if an event is being postponed or cancelled?
So I think that would depend on the item that you are getting from the vendor. The test for fairness is always that it has to be reasonable and it has to be just. So I would suggest that the couple, again, it goes back to what we were saying about a responsible couple. And a couple that takes ownership. The couple has to have a discussion with your vendor and say, this is the situation we have. For example, there's an elder that may be ill, or what do you consider is reasonable for us to cancel and still get our deposit, or are we able to postpone? What is your cancellation policy? What is your postponement policy? I think it's important to have those discussions with your vendor. Again, not all vendors are going to have a set cancellation policy. Some of them just make it up as they go, which is totally fine. If we use the example of a wedding cake, for example, and it's a very bespoke, specific wedding cake, and the vendor needs to spend about 3 months designing the sugar roses beforehand, canceling 2 weeks in advance is not reasonable for that vendor. However, if it's something like fresh produce that you're ordering, or a sliced fruit display, for example, canceling 2 weeks in advance may be reasonable. So that would depend on the item that you are getting from the vendor.
Okay. I think now that we understand, under normal circumstances, it is about fairness. Help me understand, under the duress of a pandemic, because we did see a lot happen during that time. And I don't know if you'd agree with me that certain vendors were certainly dealing with it in the best way they knew how. But
Absolutely.
Under the duress of this pandemic, how do couples handle things like deposits with venues or other vendors, for example? What is it that they need to be mindful of? And is a blanket approach appropriate for all vendors, really?
Okay. So, the pandemic has been with us for the past 2 years now. Initially, the pandemic threw the wedding industry into chaos because there was not a lot of legislation, not a lot of precedent, and not a lot of best practices set in place to equip vendors on how to deal with an actual pandemic. We have now been in that period for about 2 years. That's more than enough time for our vendors to sort of have an idea of how they deal with cancellations, how they deal with deposits. Again, it would be linked to the monetary value of the item. It would be linked to whether or not the item could be replaced or postponed, for example, if it's a wedding venue. And it will also be linked to the couple having these discussions with the vendor. By now, the vendor can tell when there's a peak in the numbers, or when we have a new variant, the vendor has a slightly different, or should have a slightly different policy. When lockdowns are relaxed, and now we are just currently out of the state of disaster. So that will give it gives you sort of an inkling of the fact that the numbers are going down. Our vendors would then possibly ease up on their cancellation policies as well. I think it's important to have a discussion with your vendor, and it is important for you, before you conclude the contract, to sit down with your vendor and see and discuss what their policy is in more or less a post-pandemic climate that we are moving into. That's not to say that COVID is now non-existent. I mean, heaven forbid, if the bridal couple then contracts COVID and everything is cancelled, you want to make sure that you have reasonable vendors on board. There's a small concept that I want to share. It's a very common concept, but it's more so we're applying it now in law, considering that we are pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and post-pandemic. So it's simply the concept of Ubuntu, and we discuss it with regards to Ubuntu in law, and that's quite I think quite a reasonable comment, or quite a reasonable concept that I want to unpack a little bit. You sit down with your vendor, you make sure that you've got a good relationship with them, and you say to them, look, I don't want you to lose out on this business. I know how important this business is for you. If we have to cancel, is it reasonable to ask for a postponement? Could we get a voucher? Could we perhaps sell our date or our monetary value to another couple? How can we work this out? There is no blanket answer for that. And it needs to be created, between the vendor and the couple. You decide what works for you. For example, if it's a couple that's flying in from overseas, or if it's a destination wedding, it's not going to be very easy for the vendor and the couple to just say, well, give us a voucher and let's do a postponement. So it has to depend on the specific circumstances of that vendor and of that couple.
I really must say, I enjoy hearing this word Ubuntu and the approach. It seems like such a mature way to engage as humans. I think at the end of the day, we mustn't take away from the fact that we're all humans, we all have emotions. And it's so nice to know that there is a method that's being included, even from a legal perspective, that allows for that humanity to exist. I feel that too often, and especially on social media, there is far too much of attack that goes on behind, I think behind the screen. And in this specific sense, you're taking a very positive outlook from the onset. Your intention is pure.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, perfect. I think you've handled one topic over there that really piqued my interest, and it's the concept of deposits. Because let's not forget, every vendor needs a certain amount of money in order to at least purchase materials, secure venues. And I needed to understand a little bit about that personally. Is that are full deposits at 100% absolutely mandatory? And if so, what retribution does a couple actually have if there's poor quality or lack of service delivery then?
So the concept of deposits is quite an involved topic. And very recently, the Consumer Goods and Services Ombudsman released a 49-page guideline on deposits dealing with the event, function, and wedding industry, because various vendors have different interpretations of what is considered a reasonable deposit. So let's try and break it up into two simple chunks. The first one would be items or vendors of small monetary value. It might be more convenient and work out cheaper in terms of cash deposit fees, etc., for a couple to pay the full amount of an item that has a small monetary value. For example, a fruit display or a sweetmeat display, garlands, a mehndi artist, smaller monetary value items. Having said that, though, it is a couple's responsibility to make sure that they keep proofs of payment, invoices, and receipts to make sure that they've got their source documents. Also ensure that any meetings that you've had verbally, as I've mentioned previously, are reduced to a short WhatsApp, SMS, or even a small written document on the backside of a receipt or an invoice to make sure that a meeting of minds is easily proven. So for smaller items like that, it would the couple would then have to make a call and see whether it's just less hassle for them to pay the full amount. And you do have your source documents in place in the event that there is a dispute. When it comes to higher monetary values, that's where it gets a little bit more tricky. I would recommend for your higher value items, like your photographer, your venue, your caterer, you have well-drafted agreements and contracts that discuss your deposits. And if you are not comfortable paying a full amount before your function, have that discussion with your vendor. At the end of the day, a contract or an agreement is a meeting of minds. If you are not comfortable paying the full amount to that vendor, there is no meeting of minds unless you have a discussion and the vendor says, look, we can add in a clause here to say, if I don't deliver, or if you feel I'm going to run away with your money, these are your recourses that you may take. It's important, again, to have that conversation with your vendor. Also, I think it's it's good practice for your couple to read every clause in that contract, especially discussing cancellations and deposits. Don't overlook it. Understand when a deposit is going to be withheld. Understand that if it's a refundable deposit, for example, if it's to avoid any damage at a wedding venue, understand when that refund will be made to you. Understand, are there going to be any checks on the venue? Who is going to check that venue to decide whether you are entitled to the refundable deposit or not? And for example, if it's a photographer or a videographer or a caterer who insists on the full monetary payment, ensure that the both of you have an understanding to say what would constitute no delivery or what would constitute my expectations not being met. And we need to understand and agree on what my rights of recourse are going to be thereafter. That might get a little bit involved because if it's a high monetary value item and you feel like you cannot manage going to small claims court on your own, you may have to get lawyers involved, and each party is going to have to prove what expectation wasn't met. It's very easy, for example, if a wedding venue said that they're going to have your wedding and then they end up canceling on you. But if it's a caterer, it gets a little bit more tricky, because what constitutes my expectations not being met? Is it a subjective or is it an objective test? For example, if you say, well, I'm not paying you the last 20% of your money because food didn't taste good, that's subjective. And that's not something that you can very easily get away with in terms of the law with your vendor. So I think that just to sum up, it depends on the size of the monetary value that the vendor is placing in your event. It may work out quite feasible for you as a couple to pay up in full for your smaller monetary value items. When you do that, proof of payments, invoices, receipts, conversation, confirming what the agreement is, keep that. In the event that there's a misunderstanding, higher value items, read your contracts, ask about cancellations, ask about deposits, understand what the three mean, and understand what rights of recourse you have if something is not met to your expectations.
It's a lot to bear in mind, you have to admit.
It is a lot of information, yeah.
I think the fact that there's a 49-page document states it, I think it definitely relates to the importance of deposits. And I think the importance of, like you say, the meeting of minds. The reason I want to emphasize that point is, you know, one of the biggest reasons I created the Get Me Wed platform is because I did feel it was not just a meeting of minds when people fell in love, but also a meeting of minds when you're doing business with people in this industry. They are passionate about what they do, and different people have very different passions and different takes on certain professions that they lead with, certain skills that they lead with. And it's important that you know who you're engaging with and whether or not this is something you're comfortable with. So I absolutely loved that entire line, meeting of minds. It really did appeal to me. I think also what I want to emphasize about this conversation to our viewers is that, you know, we are not discussing this conversation because we feel that there is a problem that exists in the industry. Neither are we doing it to try and promote litigation. I think the important thing about our conversation today is that amidst everything that we've gone through in the past 2 years, we do see now an incline, certainly, in the number of events that are taking place. And it is really an act of creating mindfulness to couples and to vendors about how to engage amongst each other so that we are able to have successful events with either party involved.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Kashmir, for your time.
I think I just wanted to mention also, we must just, the first prize is a successful wedding. Yes. Not litigation. This is not to promote the small claims court or to promote lawyers' letters being sent. The first prize is a successful wedding. So I think if we have responsible vendors and couples, all we want at the end of the day is a fantastic event for the couple, not in the event that we need to now litigate. Let's make sure we have all of that done. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for reaffirming that, Kashmir. It's so appreciated.